Who can interview marker? Take one, soft sticks.
I'd like to just begin really sort of simply with how your story, how you first met Dr. King and got here to this place.
Well, in 1966, I had been working in Birmingham, Alabama, for Hosea Williams. I had just started working for SCLC. It was like Birmingham 2. Even though the Voting Rights Act of '65 had passed, you still had to get federal registrars into many of the towns across the South, and Birmingham being recalcitrant as it has always been, we were doing that. So we were getting, blocking intersections and getting kids out of school, much like they did in 1963. There weren't any dogs or fire hoses around this time, but it was just as violent in the sense that 5,000 to 10,000 people went to jail. Ultimately, the feds came in and we got federal registrars. So Dr. King had come to Birmingham. He had been in Birmingham several times when I was there. He got arrested 3 times in Birmingham and actually filed suit with Hosea Williams in Birmingham to desegregate the jails in Jefferson County, which is the county Birmingham was in. I was in jail for 2.5 days. They had really vicious treatment. As a white dude in the civil rights movement, when I would get arrested in demonstrations, they wouldn't put me with the brothers. They'd be putting me in with the, well, I won't say crackers, but I just use that word. And that was a very, very, very difficult situation. You hear my brother saying, "Oh, freedom," and I'd be sitting there listening to these people talking about me being a nigger lover. Everybody was white that was in the movement, and I'm not Jewish, thought I was a Jew, and they'd call me kike and all these other kinds of things. But anyway, so Hosea Williams and I filed suit in Birmingham, and then Dr. King came over to Birmingham to basically congratulate everybody for winning the victory, because we were starting to register thousands of people a day in Birmingham, where they were registering 10 to 20 people a day. And he was just kind of kidding and was talking to Bernard Lee, who was his assistant, and really his assistant. And he said to Bernard, he said, Bernard, I've got so much mail back in Atlanta. He said, you think that anybody in here could help out? And Bernard said, no, I can write in here. And Dr. King said, I raised my hand, and he said, I had heard, Tom, that you hadn't even finished high school. How can you write? And I said, well, I was on my high school newspaper before I got kicked out, before I quit, actually. And I said, I'm a pretty good writer. I can answer mail. He said, well, you can come back to Atlanta and stay at the Freedom House. You want to ride back tomorrow with someone, or do you want to take the bus back? I said, well, I'll take the bus back on Sunday. So I took a bus from Birmingham to Atlanta, and the bus came down Auburn Avenue and let me off in front of the SCLC office. In those days, there were no cell phones, at all, so you had to go across the street and put a nickel into the payphone, and I called the SCLC. We used to have freedom houses here. SNCC had one, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and SCLC had one at Dr. King's old home, which is unfortunately has been torn down now. But so I was expecting someone to come pick me up, so I was waiting in front of SCLC's office on Auburn Avenue. And Dr. King's church, of course, was down the street, and he had just got through preaching. It was about 1:30, 1:45 in the afternoon. He saw me standing outside. He said, oh, Tom, you're here. I said, yeah, I'm waiting for someone to give me a ride to the Freedom House. And he had Coretta and the 4 kids in the car, so I didn't think it'd have room for me anyway. And, I said, oh, I'll wait for the ride. And he said, no, I'll give you a ride over there. And then so the kids all 4 kids got in the back. Coretta got in the middle, and I was at the window. His was at a green 1966 Bonneville that he owned. And we went over to we got in the car, and he said, why don't you come have lunch with us? Here I am, a 19-year-old kid, and here Martin Luther King Jr. is asking me to come to their house for Sunday lunch. In those days I was considerably lighter, but I had far more hair. So I said, okay. So I went over to the King house. I'm kind of nervous, although Coretta was asking me a lot of questions that I wanted to know where I was from and, so forth, and the kids in the background. And then Marty shouts out, can you play football? And I said, yeah, I can play a little bit of football. He said, would you play football with us? He says, my friend Ralph Abernathy's coming over, his son Ralph Abernathy III, and my cousin Isaac. He said, we're going to have a little football game in the front yard. So I said, well, I'm just going to have lunch and probably go back to the Freedom House, but we'll see. So we got to get in, and Dr. King, there was a long table. I guess maybe 12 people were at lunch. this is a Sunday lunch, so it was a chicken this, chicken that. Dr. King loved chicken wings, chicken gizzards, chicken livers, breast, fried chicken, corn pudding, 2 or 3 different kinds of greens, and then a big pie. Now, most of the cooking was done by Dr. King, and Mrs. King had a cook/housekeeper. Her name was Lockhart. And Mrs. Lockhart was never referred to by her first name by the Kings at all. They referred to her by her last name. It's always Mrs. Lockhart. And so after she got to serving everybody, Dr. King said the blessing, and Mrs. Lockhart sat down and had lunch with us. So the household help, if you will, was part of the family and at the dinner table. So we got through dinner, and Dr. King said he had to go over to he had another little office in town. He said he had to go to that office. He said, "Well, you want to ride over to the Freedom House?" I said, "Yeah, let me call Jose and see if he's there." And Jose wasn't there. And then Coretta says to me, she says, "Well, Don, why don't you stay and chat for a while? And, we'll talk. I'd like to fight about Boston and stuff like that." So I said, okay. And so I started talking with her, and the kids actually drugged me outside. And they took me out front of the house, and I started playing football with them. And as we were playing football, they came up with an very affectionate term, I guess you could say, a double entendre, if you will, Uncle Tom. And that's what they called me. And so I enjoyed playing football. But then I went back in, and Coretta was on the phone, and I said, "I'm going to call and get a ride back over to SCLC because Dr. King hadn't been back yet." She said, "No," she said, "chat and stay for a while." And, so Coretta was very outgoing. And so we chatted, and she stayed. She said, "By the way, do you have your driver's license?" And I said, kind of strange, "Well, yeah." I said, "I have my driver's license. I don't have a car, but I said I have my driver's license." She said she has been having some trouble with her driver, that person that has been assisting her, and she really could use some help taking the kids to school. Now, you got to remember, this is 1966. A white boy, taking 4 black kids to school. Daddy King had some problems with it, I'll be honest with you. Martin didn't seem to mind at all, but she never really asked to see my license. It wasn't until the next day when I actually drove the kids to school. In those days, by the way, you had no GPSs, so you had to look at everything in a map. And so I agreed that I would take the kids to school. Jose said, "What? He just got all in a huff about me being over there having lunch." And of course, the brothers and the sisters that were in there were just kind of jealous of the fact that I was eating lunch with Dr. King, and now I was going to start driving for him. It was kind of contentious. People ribbing me, "Well, what's this white boy doing over here, but it rolled off my back, and so I actually driven the car, which I was driving, a blue Impala, which is still around, 1966 Impala, back to the Freedom House. And so that's where I stayed, which is where everybody from the field would stay, what they call the foot soldiers. And so I came back and I stayed there, and I started to drive for the family and Dr. King. I'd pick him up at the airport, and he and Ralph, and I'd go to the office with them, get the mail. And so the first few days, I wasn't really answering mail. I was really working around things at the King household. But it was that moment that I really developed a relationship with Dr. King and the King family. And for me, Atlanta, from my dentist and my doctor to, everybody else, I met everybody in their circle. Zenona Clayton, all these people in their circle. So, but I was still on SCLC's payroll, which was $25 a week then. It wasn't a whole lot of money. And Andy Young said to Martin, he said, "Now Tom's working for you. You need to pay him out of your payroll." And so Andy, when he was head of the list, Andy was executive director of SCLC. So every time he'd come up every month on the payroll, he would take me off the payroll and put me on Martin, and Dr. King would say to him, "Andy, no, Tom works for us, works for SCLC." And I think Andy gets a joke out of this, but I think he fired me 4 times, and every time he fired me, Dr. King would put me back on the staff.
Could you back up just a little bit about how you actually got down from Boston to here, coming out of school, like all that? And how old were you when you came here?
Well, I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1947. And I went to, actually was living in Somerville, Mass., which is right next to Cambridge. And that's where I kind of grew up until I was 6 or 7. Then my family moved to the suburbs, all right? But I really got involved in the movement in Somerville in a way. There was a black kid who had a hearing aid, and this white kid punched him, and his hearing aid fell out. And at that moment, I was bullying, in a sense, bullying and racism, but both at the same time. And it was at that moment I realized that, what was going on, not just with that kind of situation, but around this whole country. I started reading and hearing about, slavery. I started, I didn't, know any of that kind of stuff. This is a 6-year-old kid, 7-year-old kid. And so I became fascinated by the movement, and I kept watching it. Of course, television was coming of age then, and we had a TV set. So we moved to Framingham, and my 3rd grade teacher was a black woman. And so she and I would go back and forth, and this is around the time of Brown versus the Board of Education, right after that. And I was just asking, why was segregation like this, and so forth. And then I would drive down in the south, we'd go to Florida, and you'd hit New Jersey, and you start seeing colored and white signs all over the place. And, I would always, my parents weren't particularly racist, but they used, there were no progressive human beings on the planet either in terms of race. So I would start going into the colored restrooms. I would start drinking out of the colored water fountain. And, I was still following the movement on TV and so forth and so on. And I realized, what that was like. And my father, said, Buster, he used to call me Buster. He said, Buster, he said, you can't do that. He said, that's for people, that's for colored people, not for you. And I said, no, it's for everybody. And that's kind of like how I really started getting involved in the movement. Then I had a friend whose father was who I remained friends with from the time that I was at Somerville, whose father was a Unitarian minister, and they were picketing in front of a Woolworths in Central Square, Cambridge, Mass., and in support and solidarity with the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. And that was my first time, and it felt good that I actually participated in a demonstration at 12. My mother died shortly thereafter, and I wound up being partly a ward of the state of Massachusetts, which was really good for me in a way, because it put me in Peabody in the school for boys, where I met Black and Hispanic, Asian kids, and everybody, rather than just being be around a bunch of white folks, and that really began to, get my politics going. And then my aunt from Cambridge, Maryland, which was having a huge movement at the time, said that she would like to take me, get me out of this boys' school. So I stayed in this boys' school for about 3-4 months. Then moved to Cambridge, Maryland with her. And of course, Cambridge, Maryland was a hotbed. Gloria Richardson headed up a movement in Cambridge, and they were integrating, and even though I was in the school here, an all-white school. And this is in Cambridge, Maryland in 1963. It was a time, 62 actually, 62, 63, when Cambridge, Maryland, that really brought me out and told me that this is my endeavor, this is my goal, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to organize. I want to change the face of America's racial inequality. And so I actually started to go over to the mass meetings. And I've got 2 or 3 other white kids actually to come join me over to these meetings. And my aunt was kind of a progressive woman. She, and anyway, while I was living in Cambridge, her son-in-law had just finished in Annapolis, and a plane went down in Jacksonville, Florida, and Naval Station down there. So we moved to Jacksonville. And then I wound up going to a high school named after the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I immediately got myself involved in political action. It was kind of an interesting thing. I was sociable, and I got along with people in the school. And matter of fact, this was a time that these white kids, even in the South, were dealing with, Vietnam and dealing with, So I got about 150 kids really organized, go to weekly NAACP meetings, youth council, and demonstrations downtown. The first time I went to St. Augustine, and I met Jose in St. Augustine. This is 1963, and I was still in high school. So I stayed in Jacksonville. I got kicked off my high school newspaper because I tried to change the name of the paper in the school. And then Selma came along. And I had about had it at this point. So I saw John and Jose as they led the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I saw them getting whipped, and I saw the way that that movement was and how, so I decided I was going to go to Selma. And that's when I really started. Never really looked back after that. I worked in the summer of 66, 65 rather, Mobile, Alabama, and Greenville, Mississippi, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. More was SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. But I knew people from SCLC from my St. Augustine experience and followed the movement very closely. I knew all the cast of characters.
So when you find yourself driving Dr. King and the kids around, what was it like? Let's say with Dr. King, you describe him like what's his personality, the music he would listen to. What was that like?
Well, you listen to WAOK radio, which is in WERD, which was upstairs from Dr. King's office. And he didn't have cell phones, as I mentioned earlier. He didn't have cell phones. So I mean, it was just me and him, and maybe Abernathy. He liked to play a lot of tricks on Abernathy, Houcks. He called them pork chops. That was his nickname for Ralph, pork chops, and that was his best friend. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, he was everywhere with Ralph. Ralph was very, very close to him. So driving around with Dr. King would be. He would kid me about my driving, say I was driving too slow. And then, he would say, he'd ask me questions like, what are the kids doing? What kind of looks are you getting driving the kids around town? He would talk to me a little bit about the movement, about what was happening, and just particularly then about going into Chicago and the slums and the battle against housing discrimination, the open housing. I was telling him, always I would say, he said, "Tom, you don't really want to drive, do you?" And I said, "Not really. I'm a hell of an organizer. I want to get out here and organize again." But he would talk about the family. He would talk about the music. He loved Aretha. Absolutely loved Aretha. And if he wanted to listen to the gospel station, when ERD was more of a gospel station, he loved Mahalia Jackson. He one time said, I think at a mass rally, that a voice like hers comes along once in a millennium. His enjoyable, but we'd always stop, by the way, a little store around the corner from his house on Sunset, where he would go in and buy a bug ticket, which is now the lottery. And it's, so he would play the bug. He enjoyed that. He also would come across the street and I'd go with him, from SCLC's office where there was a VFW hall. In the VFW hall, some of the staff would come in and he'd sling back a beer, have a little bit of scotch, and he would be a very regular person. He was not, Dr. King had no security around him. Dr. King didn't have any, posse. It was not until the day he was assassinated in Atlanta. There was no police presence outside his house except for the FBI. But by and large, King was just a very regular person, and there was no airs about him. A couple times he'd fall asleep in the car and did snore. He didn't. He was like, he loved the OJs, by the way, too. Several people he liked in terms of music. And he and Coretta often went to the old Royal Peacock Club down here on Auburn Avenue, and then over to La Carousel Lounge and Pascal's Hotel, which was the place to be prior to 1964 and the public accommodations. But actually, Atlanta was a bit earlier than that, 62, when they integrated the hotels. But Dr. King liked to go to clubs. He enjoyed it, enjoyed the music. I didn't see him dance much, but I knew he could dance. But Coretta could dance very well. He was, how would you describe it? A jovial person in terms of cracking jokes. So many instances I can think of, but I think what happened was a lot of auto dealers from the north would send cars to the south for civil rights workers to use, and there was this one Chevrolet, which actually Dr. King gave to me to drive around in, which had a hole in the floorboard in the back. So he had called to the house and wanted to know if I was there. I said, yeah. He said, you're going to come pick Ralph and I up at the airport. And I said, yeah, I'll come pick you up. And so he said, I don't want you to bring my car. I want you to bring that car I gave you, that Chevrolet with the floorboard, and we're going to put Ralph through the hole in the back. And so we get to the airport, and Ralph's standing there, making his little moves, and Dr. King said, now Ralph, you got to sit in the back. I'm sitting up front with Tom. And so as Ralph gets in, he goes right down through the floorboard, and Martin starts laughing, and I was worried about Ralph. Ralph actually he tore his pants, and so Ralph said, now why did you do that to me? Why did you do that to me? And everybody said, well, we just tried to have some fun with you, chops. And so, but it was, and it kind of, he would do that constantly. I mean, and he would also, show the kids. They had a small pool table, not a big pool table in the house. He'd show the kids his latest pool moves when he came home. He mentioned he sort of saw himself as a little hustler.
So would he how about smoking cigarettes too? Was that a...
Yes, he smoked about a couple packs a day, L&Ms, and usually he would cut a hole in the bottom of the package. And I said, keep the tobacco fresh is what he would say. And Coretta hated it. I mean, she absolutely, was trying to get him to stop, He didn't smoke very much around the kids. I'll say that, he did not do that. But at one point he started asking me to hold his cigarettes. Because Coretta would always check as we would go up the stairs, check and see any cigarettes in his pocket. So, but he had a little room in the house, which is like his office, where he smoked it most of the time. And then, of course, he smoked in his own office here. In those days, everybody smoked. So, I mean, it was no, 1966, 67, 68, it was no, smoking was, the cigarette tobacco companies were the major sponsors on TV.
And in terms of being the pool hustler, how about with that same world, how about like dressing in cologne? Was he like a dapper in that kind of...
Well, Ralph was the cologne freak, and Martin would kid him about it. He said, Ralph is taking a shower today in that cologne, just a shower. And that, by the way, has moved generational. His son was a big cologne person, and Isaac Farris, who's Dr. King's nephew, Christine King Farris' son, loves cologne too. Now, Martin was not a big cologne person. He did wear cologne, but he was not a big cologne person. Dr. King, said Ralph had enough to go around. He said you can always smell Ralph before you can see him.
Did he ever joke about the fact that he had a white driver, a black man with a white driver?
Well, it was interesting. Daddy King, more than anybody else, was really concerned about it. He said, this is Atlanta. He said, this is, we're not talking about New York City. We're talking about Atlanta. And, and I did get, very strange looks. And matter of fact, twice I got pulled over, really for not doing anything but driving with black folks. But I picked the kids up at school. I got to know some of the parents, and, of course, I got to know a lot of the kids' friends. But both times that I got stopped, one ticket was for running a stop sign, which I didn't do, and I think the other ticket was going 35 and a 30. Daddy King actually got the tickets fixed. He was a good political person in Atlanta, and he earned it. I mean, he went in the 40s. He was a leader in getting the first black cops in Atlanta, and, he was the one getting street lights on Auburn Avenue, mundane things, but back in 1948, you had a very segregationist Jim Crow era. It was that, and Atlanta was Atlanta changed a lot, but Atlanta was still a very rigid, segregated city. William Hartsfield was not an integrationist mayor. William Hartsfield, for those who don't know, his name is on the airport with Maynard Holbrook Jackson, who was Atlanta's first black mayor.
Did you get the feeling that Dr. King understood how historic everything was while it was happening? Did he understand that they were living history?
I, of course, being around Dr. King, and not only just in the office at SCLC and helping answer mail, which I did with Dora McDonald, who was this, I realized that Dr. King was not only cognizant of what was going on, okay, but really far ahead of his time. He obviously knew, and he would preach about it. He would say, I've won all these awards, but that doesn't make any difference. You can call me a drum major for justice. He understood what his role was, and he, of course, stayed on the phone with, I would say, 3 or 4, Harry Belafonte being one of them, but probably Andy Young, and of course Ralph, and with Harry Wattell and Stan Levinson, who were 2 of his good friends who were New York lawyers, and they worked very closely with Dr. King and with Coretta. So he would constantly, and I would overhear, even though I was not asked to be part of the strategy session, I would overhear what they were talking about and where they were going to go. So the first time I really realized it was when they were going to Chicago, and he wanted to have. It was always kind of an interesting role that he and Jesse Jackson played, and so I would hear the conversations that he was having with people regarding that, and I would hear conversations that he would have on a strategy of dealing with Daley in Chicago and how that was going to work out. Dr. King had won all the battles in the South except for maybe Albany, Georgia. He had won almost all the battles that he went into. He had a strategy using nonviolence as a way to break down those violent and hateful sheriffs and mayors and white folks that were opposed to integration and opposed to mixing of the races, as they would say. So he understood clearly what role he had. He already won the Nobel Peace Prize by the time I met him. He had already led the March on Washington and had his famous speech that is heard around the world on January 15th every year, I Have a Dream. He had already led, the march from Selma to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act had already passed. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 had already passed. Dr. King was moving into new grounds, a lot of new grounds, taking on the establishment, not only the establishment in Washington, the black political establishment in the country, about Vietnam, and beginning to talk against the war, which pissed LBJ off greatly. And LBJ was a great ally. I mean, as much as you, hear how he talked, he did something I don't know whether Kennedy could have gotten done, which is pass the 64 Civil Rights Act and pass the 65 Voting Rights Bill. And so, I'm sure that the language that LBJ was using in the White House and Martin was mimicking him. He used to kind of talk like how LBJ would talk, and he knew that how that was pissing Lyndon off, and he also knew that Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and others say that we should keep one battle going at a time, and our battle still is the civil rights movement. It's not the anti-war movement. It's not going into the economic issues you're beginning to talk about, changing the economic structure of America. And so, he would talk about that constantly. And then even people in the organization, and this is back 66, 67 particularly, I had left driving for Dr. King and started to organize what we started a college department in SCLC. And my job was to help organize anti-war demonstrations. And as a matter of fact, I was inducted, and Dr. King actually wrote a letter to my draft board, which was Jacksonville, Florida, where I was living at the time, which was turned down. Dr. King wrote a letter to my draft board and asking that I be given CO status, which is conscientious objective status with SCLC. And so what happened, was that at this point, the movement was changing so dramatically. SNCC was no longer the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was Stokely and Rapp, and I would hear different things with Stokely. I actually became friends. This is interesting. A lot of people, when I was working for the Kings, and I was just 19, 20 years old, want to meet me around them. Cleve Sellers and Stokely, who worked for SNCC, who I'd known, but I became better friends with them in '66. And of course, John Lewis, who's still one of my best friends today. But John, so I spent a lot of time with John and Julian Bond. And Julian was actually Martin's neighbor, lived down the street. When Julian was elected to the State House of Representatives, and his seat was denied because of white Democrats in the Georgia General Assembly suggesting that Julian, had committed a treasonous act by supporting being against the war in Vietnam. For, I guess, almost 2 elections thereafter, kept him out of his House seat. Dr. King led marches for Julian, and it was his neighbor as well. So, and Coretta actually marched. Coretta marched. Ralph marched. We all marched for Julian in '66, and he would talk about how horrendous it was that these white racists were able to put up and do what they did, to keep him out of his seat. And these were Democrats in the South until the '60s. If you were black, you had to be a Republican because you couldn't vote. Democrats had white-only primaries.
You were talking, I'd like to go back a little bit. You were talking about the pivot to Chicago. After all these successes, we can go to Chicago and the idea of white northern racism and his troubles there. That, as you know from Boston, and I'm from the Northeast too, that how it changed and how the media, how he was viewed differently by whites as well.
He knew going into Chicago, and I was around then. I actually spent about a month in Chicago, and I didn't get arrested. There weren't a lot of arrests on our side. There were a lot of arrests on the white folks' side, but the white folks' side were, and Dr. King mentioned this many times over, worse than anything he'd ever seen in Mississippi in terms of the hatred, and in terms of their, I would say, their vicious racism, and excuse me, and it was like King thought. And he, Al Raby really headed the movement up in Chicago, and Jesse was very much a part of the movement in Chicago. And then there was a big dispute. I can remember hearing the conversations with James Orange, who was Dr. King had brought to Chicago with him. Jim Bevel had come to Chicago with him. Andy came to Chicago, of course. Andy, I'll tell you something funny. Dr. King used to say, "We don't need any white boys. We have Andy." And at any rate, in terms of going to negotiate with these people, we don't need to have white folks. We have Andy. I always would joke Andy about being a Republican, but it was Chicago that I really saw him for the first time up more in a close sense, because they had driven for him and got to know him and the family. That just how strategic he was, and how he would understood what needed to be done, and how you maneuver in a movement, your tactics, your strategy. So Martin Luther King wasn't just a great orator; he was a great strategist, and I saw that in Chicago. Even though Daley signed off on open housing in Chicago, he never really thought King should have come there anyway, that there was nothing wrong in his city. And sadly today, many of the neighborhoods we went into, Lawndale and Edgewood in the southwest side of Chicago, are some of the most violent neighborhoods in the country. And in the old days, in '66, that violence was perpetrated by the whites that lived in those neighborhoods. And now today, it's black on black crime, and because those white folks, once black folks started moving in southwest side of Chicago, the west side of Chicago, white folks started fleeing en masse.
And also in Chicago was the first time it felt like that the media had turned, was sort of questioning Dr. King.
Yeah, a lot of people thought King should not have taken on a battle in Chicago against Daley on open housing. Actually, the campaign was not called an open housing campaign. It was basically called the War for the Poor, and it was basically end slums. That's what the title of the movement was for Chicago: End Slums. And so many people from the organization came in, so much of the resources that came in. This wasn't Dr. King's first real foray in the North. He helped elect mayor of Cleveland, and so he actually had gone. SCLC had sent people to Cleveland. Carl Stokes, the first black mayor of a major city, and that was in '66. And then he took on Chicago after that. But he was really in a turmoil. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, what role? And of course, there was black ministers all over the country that were members of SCLC, and then Operation Breadbasket started in Chicago. But what role would SCLC have in a northern movement? And just how far would they go in that movement, and how successful could they be? Well, Chicago was a tad of a slapdown. Daley signed off, as I said earlier, on basically opening up housing and stopping redlining, which he never really did. But to get King out of that, that's what he said. So he was very Dr. King left. I mean, he left Chicago, and I think that he didn't feel. I didn't think he felt like he had to really recalibrate his aspect of the movement, that it was no longer just a civil rights movement. It was now an economic movement. It was now a movement to involve all different kinds of people all over the country. And that began to evolve when he started to come out against the war in Vietnam, setting himself not only apart, but also moving forward to the Poor People's Campaign, which was going to tear down the walls of injustice in D.C. and build a wonderful resurrection city that was going to do a total reorganization of the economics and the economic system of the country.
Did you think there were any parallels today between the white backlash of the white working class in Chicago and the election of Trump and the sort of white working class northeastern, the election results?
They just moved to the suburbs and voted for Trump. No, I mean, I'm not kidding you. I mean, what happened in Chicago, I think, was in a sense a wake-up call for King, in a real sense, that what you had in the South was merit, was mirrored at least 10 times over in the North. And even though the unions in the North and many of those people that were out there, throwing fire bombs and bricks and rocks in Chicago and turning over cars and so we're union workers. We're union workers. I mean, they work many of them work for the city. And they had their nice little brick, small house out there. They wanted to protect that. They didn't want any niggers coming in and just, turning them around. And Dr. King realized that very, very, very succinctly that this was a movement that maybe he hadn't thought through as much as he should have. And there was people that wanted to march into Cicero, which he refused to. He saw the dangers of creating what was a race war essentially, and the tactics of nonviolence, which he always demanded in terms of the demonstrations. It was like very hard to deal with. Chicago had 2,000 police out there protecting us, but that didn't help because you had 5,000 to 10,000 of these white men mostly. Setting fires to cars, and many of the cops were the relatives of the people throwing the rocks and the stones and the bottles.
So it's true that while King's part of the time while King was up in Chicago, you were in the South registering voters?
No, I wasn't. Actually, what happened was I stayed with Dr. King driving for the family from, I guess, February, March of '66 until, in Chicago was in the summer of '66. I was still driving for him, but I really wanted to go up and participate in the demonstrations. So I went up and participated in the demonstrations, and I wound up staying there. And kids were getting ready to go back to school, and so I came back to Atlanta and finished up probably another 2 or 3 months driving for the King family, but becoming more involved in the organization and organizing. In Chicago, I actually visited the flat that Dr. King rented. Mrs. King went up there as well. Coretta went up there as well, and James Orange sort of oversaw that whole thing, and Dr. King's foray into the West Side. He wasn't just dealing with open housing. He was dealing with rents. He was dealing with housing, and he was dealing with all the issues in Chicago, besides just the open housing demonstration. The open housing demonstrations in Chicago actually became a diversion from what King had originally set off to do in Chicago, which was to end the slums in the West Side of Chicago. But to do that, you had to have access to housing, and that's when that aspect of the demonstrations came in the south and southwest side of Chicago. And it was very much like the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign in 1968 didn't set out to have a march and demonstrations in Memphis. They set out to bring everybody from 3 corners of the country to Washington to go to Resurrection City. So that the original plan of the Poor People's Campaign was not to have Memphis as its nexus.
What about tell us about can you paint a picture of visiting with the Coretta and the kids in Lawndale, in that project, in that apartment? What was it like? How did the family react to living in?
And it was a 3-floor walk up. It was not the kids didn't live there too long. I think the kids stayed a couple weeks. And there in Chicago, you did have Dr. King did have security around him, and not of his own doing, but they decided that this is what they were going to do. So it wasn't as rat infested as some of the other places. Dr. King wanted to deal with the Cabrini Greens, which, for those people who don't know, are big housing projects in Chicago, the old Taylor homes in Chicago, which really housed people like in cages. And he wanted to deal with those. He wanted to deal with all these kind of things, and he met with Daley several times about this. But the place in Chicago was James Orange, who oversaw the project. James Orange was one of Dr. King's field organizers and lieutenants. Got a place fixed up. Actually, got a new refrigerator and painted the different rooms and so forth. So it was not like he was living in the same kind of squalor as somebody else in the neighborhood, but it was quite a different change of that. But then again, King, when he moved in 1963 from Johnson Avenue in Atlanta, he could have lived in any one of the finer Atlanta neighborhoods. I mean, he could have gone out with Ralph Abernathy, where his father was Daddy King, to a new development that an Atlanta builder named Herman Russell had built, and a lot of black folks were moving out to out there, and he chose not to. He chose to move to Vine City. So I mean, King, you gotta really look at him in the terms of what he wanted to do. He didn't want to, have a showboat kind of attitude about him. He wasn't bougie, and neither was Coretta. So I mean, he actually, as I heard the story, because I wasn't there then in '63, that everybody wanted him Daddy King, and wanted to move to Collier Heights, which is a upper class neighborhood in Atlanta, and they're building all these new houses out there. He went out there to take a look at the houses, and then he said, "No, I want to be closer to town." And he moved into a very historic neighborhood in Atlanta called Vine City on Sunset Avenue, in a relatively modest bungalow. I mean, 4 bedrooms, but it was modest bungalow. It was a little bit different than the rest of Vine City. You call it like the Vine City Heights, if you would. But right around the corner was Atlanta's first black millionaire, Alonzo Herndon, who had founded Atlanta Life Insurance Company. He was dead then, but he built that house there. And you had a vibrant shopping area down there on Magnolia Street, and at the corner of Dr. King Street was a music venue that was the head of the Chitlin Circuit. And the Chitlin Circuit was an amazing thing. And you'd have people like Bobby Blue Boy Bland come through there, and B.B. King, and you go through June. All the famous stars would come. So they tore down that place, by the way, while I actually was driving for Dr. King. They tore down the Magnolia Ballroom. But and then there was also down at the corner of the street on Sunset where Dr. King lived, not just the place where he buy his cigarettes and his bug tickets, but across the way there was. In the days of segregation, there was a drive-in here And that drive-in was at the corner of Sunset, which is now Joseph E. Boone. And the thing that separated that drive-in from the Varsity was they had a pole dancer in this place, and Martin would always kid about that. And he had this big joke as well, because next to him on Sunset Avenue in Atlanta were 4 morticians. There were 4 owners of funeral homes that lived right next to him, between he and Julian Bond. And he would always kid Julian. He said, "Yeah, Julian, we have death row between us." And Julian's first wife still lives there, by the way. But that's where they developed a good relationship, as did the kids. I think one time, I think this was after I left, but Coretta told me the story. By the way, Coretta gave me my first permanent. I had big black afro at one point in my life, and she gave me my first permanent. But I got along with her in an unbelievable way until the day she died. I mean, I was very, very close to her. I think that she probably saw me as a son figure in some ways, but she always took me under her wing. She always, even after I left the movement, after I left working for SCLC, we remained friends and real close. And of course, I remained close to Dexter and to Marty, much closer to Dexter than any of the other kids. Dexter probably has, in the way he thinks and the way he acts, probably more than any of the other kids, he would have, I think, that had Dr. King lived, that Dexter would have found a role far more significant in the movement. Marty, or Martin, as he's known as today, he doesn't like to be called Marty anymore, and he would have been. He just didn't seem like to have that. He didn't even finish Morehouse. I went to Morehouse and didn't finish it. And Yolanda was the actress, the theatrical person in the family, and she was wonderful. I mean, she passed away far too young. And Bernice, I don't know what happened to Bernice. I'm very close to Bernice, but not that close. Bunny, as we called her back in those days. She became very much enamored with the powerful mega churches, or as I call them, the ATM ministries, and worked with Bishop here, Eddie Long, for a long time. Even though she got her theology degree from Emory, she became not part of the movement for social justice churches like Ebenezer still is under Raphael Warnock, or Big Bethel is down the street on Auburn Avenue. The 3 big churches are still social justice churches, and so she kind of took a different path. With Eddie Long, she even marched to Dr. King's grave against gay people and lesbians, and Coretta was very supportive of that cause, and I think Martin would have been as well.
Can we go back quickly to the drive-in? Did he ever go to the drive-in movie?
I'm not going to say. It wasn't a drive-in movie. It was a drive-in restaurant where they had a pole dancer out there in the middle in the place. Oh yeah, he went there. I mean, everybody did. I mean, it was like the Varsity, which was kind of an interesting thing. But Dr. King, you can build him up into the sainthood all you want. I mean, he was a regular human being, and he liked to have fun. A few weeks ago, I do civil rights tours. I might as well get a plug in here. I do civil rights tours in Atlanta, where I take people to many of the locations we're talking about today. And about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had this 92-year-old woman who had gone to college with Martin. Was only 14 to 17 when he finished Morehouse. He was 17, and he was 14 when he finished high school at Washington High School. But she remembers him specifically, and the person that she had on the bus was 88 and was a good friend of Christine King Farris, who was Dr. King's sister. Dr. King, if he was alive today, this would be the 50th anniversary of the assassination. But if he was alive today, he'd be 89 years old. I mean, we'd be a very different Martin Luther King today than what we saw at 39, because he was only 39 when he was assassinated. So when I was driving him and I was 20 years old, I was working with him, and until the time he was assassinated, which was I was 23, and I spent another year with SCLC. He was a very young man. I mean, we're not talking. He was 25 years old when he led the movement in Montgomery. You almost could conceive of that today, of somebody that young having that much power and having that much ability to be able to change the dynamic of the situation. And he wasn't supposed to do that. I mean, he became in 65, I'm sure you've gone over this, in 55 rather, but he became, Ralph Abernathy was really the big church in Montgomery. And Martin had what Ralph's church was what's called a brick church, brick by brick church, was actually built by Masons and so forth. Martin had this little church on Dexter Avenue, which his son's named after, which was kind of what Ralph used to call it. And I would hear them talk about this, by the way, talking about conversations I would overhear. And he used to talk about when I came to Atlanta, you had your dad and that big church over there, but he said I had to find myself a church. But Ralph had the big church in Montgomery, and Martin had the small church, but it was the small church he wanted. And it was a church that had a lot of professionals in Montgomery, that with their nurses and doctors and postal workers, by the way, which was considered then in the black community a great job, and teachers and professors from Alabama State and so forth. So Dr. King had kind of as Ralph would call it, kind of the uppity crowd. And he said, I had the people.
Did Coretta and Martin ever, they have like a date night where they would?
Yeah. I mean, they would hang out with Ralph and Juanita Abernathy, quite a bit. Big Clayton was a good friend of hers, and she had several other friends. I mean, they went out quite frequently. They would go to the La Carousel Lounge, as I said. They would go there quite a bit, and Dr. King loved. They would take the family on occasion. The whole family would go over to Pascal's and have dinner, and he would go probably, I would say, 2 or 3 times a month. They would go to the movies, or Coretta loved music, so they would go to here in Atlanta, the Symphony Orchestra. So I mean, I would say they went probably more to the Symphony Orchestra than anything else. And that was Coretta's influence on that one. She basically called the shots on that one.
And when they walked around the town, were they seen as royalty when they came into Pascal's? Were they celebrities, or were they?
Oh yeah. I mean, wherever Dr. King went, he was a celebrity. I mean, he was bigger than Michael Jordan. I mean, he just really was. I mean, he was. People just looked up. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, there was only 2 pictures that were in a lot of black folks' houses in the South. One was Martin Luther King. Maybe 3 pictures. One was Martin Luther King Jr. The other one was Jesus, and the other one was John Kennedy. So yeah, he was idolized. I mean, everywhere he went. And even here in Atlanta, the white cops in Atlanta, if I were driving, they'd say, oh, there's Dr. King, there's Dr. King. And that was such an unbelievable difference. Just 5 years, 6 years earlier, he was put in Reidsville because he was arrested with the students in the student movement here, and he had an outstanding ticket for, I guess, not having a proper driver's license or tag. And they took him in shackles to Reidsville. And that probably changed the election in 1966. Nixon, who was a friend of Daddy King's, wouldn't help out. So Coretta wound up going to the Kennedys. And the Kennedys talked Richard Russell into getting Dr. King out of jail. Coretta was very concerned about him in that jail by himself. But it was only 6 years earlier, so I mean that was not that long from the time I started driving them until that violent attitude towards King in Georgia existed. And of course, you got to realize as well, after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a lot of people reluctant to honor him in a dinner here, and it took Robert Woodruff from Coca-Cola, throwing down the gauntlet and saying, "Damn, you're going to organize this thing here for Martin Luther King." As he was chopping his little cigar. He just said, we're going to do this. But that took some pushing. And some rabbis and some priests and preachers had to do that.
What about the FBI? Did they ever? I know that Zernona said that they came around the SCLC. Did you ever notice? Did you have a feeling that they were lurking?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. There used to be this guy named Charlie Webster, who worked. I think he was a mole. They got hired him for the American Friends Service Committee, and he would always come around SCLC's office, and he'd be smoking a pipe, and he'd have his hat on, and he'd drive a black Chevrolet, much like you'd see outside Dr. King's house. There wasn't Atlanta police out there protection, but you'd see the FBI out there frequently. Monitoring King and watching him. Oh yeah, there was. You could see that. Well, inside SCLC side itself, the controller for SCLC, Jim Harrison, was on the payroll of the FBI, and he sat right next downstairs to Ralph, and he signed the checks.
When did you realize that he was an informant?
Jim, back in 66, 67, all right, I kind of pretty much liked the guy. He was a cool guy. He had an apartment over here when they had a club we used to hang out called the Birdcage, which Dr. King went to as well, and over on Fair Street. It's over by the Atlanta University complex. And he had an apartment in there. And everybody in SCLC would figure out, how's Jim making all this money? Have an apartment there, have everything. So a lot of people had real skepticism about what he was doing and, where he was getting his money, because he wasn't making that much money in SCLC and he wasn't cooking the books, but he remained close to Abernathy, down, and as I said, sat down the stairs. Jim was the controller for SCLC. But yeah, so was the FBI directly involved inside of SCLC? Obviously. One case I'm just pointing out. How many others, I don't know. I guess a lot of the records will be unsealed next year or this year.
Can you take us through the Poor People's Campaign and the and your work, recruiting folks?
Bernard Lafayette actually had come to me, and he said, you got, there's people around here talking about what you doing, what are you up to these days? You're not driving for the Kings. What's happening? He said, I've been beginning to develop this idea that Jack Odell and a few other people in the movement were about bringing people from Appalachia, uptown Chicago, poor white folks, bring people from the Bronx and Puerto Rican, bring people from the West, Denver and Los Angeles and New Mexico, Chicanos, together in Washington for the Poor People's Campaign. He said, would you like to organize, Bernard? I said, would you like to organize that? Come work with me on this. And I said, well, we need with Andy, At this point, there was a new executive director for SCLC, Bill Rutherford. Dr. King realized that he was going to have to raise money from new sources, and Bill Rutherford was a black guy that he thought could raise money, and he didn't think Andy could raise the money. So he the board put Bill Rutherford as executive director of SCLC and Andy as vice president. So Andy out of the day-to-day role of running SCLC, and it was run in his last year of Martin's life, not by Andy, but by Bill Rutherford. A lot of people thought Bill Rutherford was a spy, by the way, as well, but I don't think he was. But a number of people have thought that over the years. So anyway, Bernard went to Bill Rutherford, and Bill said, yeah, let's put Tom on this. Let's him do this. So I organized the meeting here in Atlanta, along with Bernard, to bring together about 100, which we paid for, SCLC paid for, which a lot of people inside SCLC were not happy about it, particularly Jose Williams. He didn't think that black folks' money should be spent putting together, organizing poor white folks, Hispanics, and Asians, or anybody but black folks. So we put together this meeting at Pascal's, and I was kind of like briefing Dr. King. We were around the office. We were talking about who was going to be there, and one of the people that was going to be there was a guy named Reyes Lopez Tijerina, and Tijerina had taken over one of the National Park Service's national parks in New Mexico, and had a bandero, it had guns and so forth. And Dr. King he says, why did you invite him? He said to me, why did you invite him? I said, because he's promised that he would do this in a nonviolent way and he wanted to meet you, and he understood you as being a great leader, and he was prepared for your leadership. He said, how am I going to tell people that this guy carrying a gun and taking over national parks is going to be in the Poor People's Campaign? He was going to question me. I think Bernard left the room at that point. But I was said, well, you'll handle it. So we get on the elevator going upstairs to where the meeting was at Pascal's restaurant here. And Jack Nelson, who was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times, he worked for the Associated Press and for the Journal-Constitution. You want to pull it a surprise, actually, but Jack gets on the elevator with us. There's about 8 or 9 of us on the elevator. He looks at Dr. King, and he says to Dr. King, he says, Dr. King, I know you're doing this meeting with all these people, but have they sworn to nonviolence? And Dr. King said, grand said, now, Jack, yes. That's what we're going to be talking about that in the meeting. He said, well, why did you invite Reyes Lopez Tijerina? This is the first question. This is what Jack Nelson from LA Times, I think he was with then. And Dr. King looked at him and said, Tijerina who? But Tijerina actually did come to Washington and put down his guns and brought about 50 people for the Poor People's Campaign. Of course, the Poor People's Campaign happened after Martin's assassination, and this was his last campaign. And there were periods during that time when Dr. King was really wondering where the support and where the, where were his old allies.
Can we talk about that? I heard that Bernard was telling us there was he did a hunger strike for a couple of days to get his vice presidents all together. Can you talk about just the strife that he'd lost a lot of his friends? This is maybe his lowest point, maybe his least popular.
It was.
Point.
And we had a retreat down. We used to have retreats in a place called Frogmore, South Carolina, the Penn Center, and Doc came to the retreat, and no one saw him for a couple of days, and wouldn't know where he was. Everybody called him Doc, by the way. Everybody in SCLC called him Doc, and and he had just said that he just wanted to make have all you argue this thing out, and I'll just come in at the end here, But he had come and relatively was to himself for a couple of days, and was, it was hard for him to make that transition, even though because he had such a hard sell, even with the staff of SCLC. Staff of SCLC questioned, about being able to bring down this country in terms of its economic powers, and many of his friends from around the country, were really questioning it as well, and he wasn't getting the money from the organizations. Dr. King gave almost every penny he made on the speech circuit to SCLC. He donated his winnings from the purse from the Nobel Peace Prize to SCLC. Dr. King was really, and he was having to do a lot more of that. He was having to go make a lot of speeches, and this is in '68. And he was, I saw him on April 1st, which is 3 days prior to the assassination. I was working in the Poor People's Campaign. I was in Knoxville, Tennessee, in that night. But I think that his mood was one, not that he wasn't caring, but how in the hell did we get to Memphis? And I think that more than anything else was not the fact that just these sanitation workers were making 25 cents an hour, which of course was of major concern to him, but how that was going to divert the attention of our going to Washington by getting involved in a movement in Memphis. And I think Jose, more than anybody, pushed for that. The march from Jose's element started off in Marks, Mississippi, which was the poorest city and county in the country. And then it progressed towards Memphis. And then as they had the demonstrations in Memphis, the violence occurred, and Dr. King couldn't leave Memphis after that. He had to stay in Memphis. And I think that staying in Memphis and the whole aspect around the sanitation workers strike was, AFSCME was, it was probably one of the, said if you want money for your poor people's campaign, and Dr. King was looking every source he could get for Washington, he knew it was going to be expensive, and AFSCME said, if you go and do these things in Memphis, we'll do a big fundraiser for you, fundraising campaign, give you hundreds of thousands of dollars for the poor people's campaign.
Could you walk us from Memphis to hearing about the last time you saw Dr. King through the end, and then the funeral?
I saw him here. He was on his way to Memphis, and he was Andy and we were together, and he said that he was saying, "I hear you, Bernard, are bringing all these people that from Chicago, but from California, New Mexico," and then he went to know who this guy Corky Gonzalez was. He keeps hearing people asking about Corky Gonzalez. He was a Chicano leader in Denver. And so we were just talking about that. And then he asked me if I had talked to Coretta, and I said, no, I haven't talked to her. He said, I'll give her a call. And they were off. I didn't give him a ride to the airport. I wasn't driving him anymore. I was an organizer. But at any rate, that was the last time I actually saw him. And they had an executive staff meeting in Memphis, which I did not go to. I was heading up to Appalachia to organize poor white folk. And so I was in Knoxville, and it was around 6 o'clock at night, and I was heading to a meeting of the Tennessee Council on Human Relations with a guy who taught at the University of Kentucky, but was from Appalachia, Ernie Austin, and these kids come out and sat in the street and said, they shot Martin Luther King. They shot Martin Luther King. I said, man, these kids, they're going to create some stuff around here if that happens. And then we turned the radio on, and there was a radio report that Martin Luther King had been shot. Well, I called the house immediately back in Atlanta, and of course Coretta was getting ready to go to the airport. And so I talked to Mrs. Lockhart for a few minutes, and she told me that what had happened. And so we went inside the meeting, which was supposed to be at this church in Knoxville, and I explained to people that, what I was doing, and I was having to get back to Atlanta as soon as possible. The campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, was still on, and that, and then I found out moments later that, indeed, King had passed. So I came back to Atlanta, drove back from Atlanta from Knoxville that night. An SCLC office was a state of all kinds of people, confusion, and mourning, crying. It was a very, very, very sad place to be. And Bernard and others, Bill Rutherford, said, no, we're gonna have to organize, get people together here for what will be a week of mourning and a funeral. And so people started meeting and parceling out different jobs for people. And then Dr. King's body was brought back, I think it was Bell Street is where he was taken, and funeral home. And it was decided that he was going to lay in wake at Spelman, and he was going to, Morehouse Spelman, and he was going to lay in wake at Ebenezer Baptist Church just prior to the funeral. And my job was to coordinate the transportation for people coming in and out of town, cars, and working on making sure people got around, got picked up at the airport. It was almost like going back to my old job. But that was my task, and during a period of heavy mourning, all right? So I actually stood watch over Dr. King's body for about 15 minutes at Ebenezer on the night before the funeral. The day of the funeral, which was probably, people started to arrive 2 days before the funeral. Ebenezer is a small church, and of course very hard to get in, and a who's who from the world was here. Including Bobby Kennedy, who 2 months later himself would be assassinated. So my job was to make sure that people got transportation over to the funeral, I guess you could call them VIPs, and help get the VIPs over to Coretta's house on Sunset, where she would meet and greet them. People that were playing were coming to give their condolences. So I actually was ahead of the funeral. About 150,000 people marched that day. The first part of it over to Morehouse was with a mule-drawn hearse carriage, and then a hearse picked him up at Morehouse after Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was his mentor, gave the eulogy. Ralph gave the eulogy at Ebenezer. And then Daddy King and a couple others gave the final words over where he was first buried at Southview Cemetery. Probably 8,000 people were at Southview Cemetery for that. And he was buried there for 3 years. Amazing how calm and collective Coretta was during the entire service in the affair. I mean, she held her composure tremendously. And she did and of course, the movement was just in a state of, what in the hell are we going to do now? I mean, there's no Martin Luther King around. And that's not meant to rhyme, but, it's in a sense is, even though so much had happened between, when you talk about that short time period from 1955 to 1968, it was incredible what occurred in this country. And a very short span. And then from 1965 to 1968, so much changed. From a Black Power movement, beginning to deal with Vietnam and a war, and then the whole battle that Dr. King was facing with in the Black civil rights community, not being supportive of his moving into these new areas. So it was a very changing time, and it was one that. SCLC continued to progress, move forward with Abernathy, the election of Abernathy. Abernathy was elected by acclamation. They mentioned Jesse's name as one of the people who would succeed him, and Andy took his name out of contention, so it was just Ralph.
Can we go back for a second to the, just you personally, how you felt when you said that night, just you alone with the casket?
I wasn't alone with the casket by myself. There was several other people standing guard around the casket. It was, how could this happen? I never talked to him directly about death, and never really he had some discussions with other people about it, although he didn't fear it. He said, we all die sometime. I think he kind of knew that there were people out there, probably the FBI, in collusion with others, that would like to see him gone. Even some radical black folks would like to see him gone, along with the normal basket of deplorables, excuse the use of that word. But it's in a sense, that's who he understood that there was always that out there. From Montgomery, when he had a gun and his house was bombed, it was. He always understood that there was but it didn't really hit me about the assassination of King until about 2 weeks later, when we had first staff meeting and a lot of the people I hadn't seen because they had been in one place or another and gotten around. That's what made me really think exactly what in the hell are we going to do now? Because he was not, as I said before, he wasn't just the preacher. He wasn't just the leader. He was the strategist. He was one that was able to pull various. Without him around, a lot of these factions wouldn't, be able to get together. So I began to feel at that time, I knew what the kids were going through, and Coretta certainly going through. She started to work on, almost day one after the funeral, on building the Martin Luther King Center, Nonviolent Center, and for social change. But it was not only a void in the movement, but in the world. It was. You can't quite compare it to a Mandela situation. When Mandela was in jail for all these years, Martin was, he was the voice, he was the face of what changed this country. And he was, to me, a friend. He was, to me, a person who I grew to love as a close friend and confidant. I could talk to him. I mean, when I needed a car, my first car, he went to Dad, who was on the board of a local bank in Atlanta, and asked Dad if he would, sign for my loan, and he did. I mean, those are the kinds of things that I missed about Dr. King a lot about, because I mean, he was closer to me than just the movement and the face of the movement.
And sort of thinking about our life today and the struggle and the political climate today, what are the lessons you learned from that struggle then?
Well, it's that old saying, dare to struggle, dare to win. We are probably, and I hate to say this, in the dusk of my life, all right, things are almost going back to where they were when I was in my 20s and in the movement. There is so many things that are happening at really a fast, rapid pace in this country today that Martin Luther King was alive today, and said he'd be 89 years old. But, what would have changed had he stayed alive? What would have been different had King lived? Had King continued to be able to have successful campaigns? Was he going to hit the wall in Washington like Ralph Abernathy did and the rest of us in the Poor People's Campaign? Would he have been able to help get involved in politics and, elect Hubert Humphrey over Richard Nixon in 1968? King was dead by that time. So wasn't Bobby Kennedy dead. But I mean, what would have changed had King lived? I mean, what would have changed in terms of the dynamics of where we are as a country in social justice? What would have changed, in terms of SCLC? And would Dr. King today not be the kind of mortal hero that we now revere had he lived? I mean, was he bigger, and has he become bigger in death than he was in life?
What would you say to people today? What can we do now to sort of honor his legacy the most?
I mean, it's people ask me that question every day. I think people have to participate in the system we struggle so hard to get, which was the electoral system. I mean, and the vote. Even though over the last 5-6 years, vote has been under attack. Not only by state legislators and state representatives and governors, but by the Supreme Court. Those are the kinds of things we got to stay vigilant at. We got to deal with questions like Black Lives Matters are bringing up today on the question. And Dr. King was very good on that one, by the way. I mean, people would always say Martin and Malcolm, I'm jumping around here, but Martin and Malcolm weren't friends. They were. He would say, Martin and Stokely weren't friends. They were. It was a very interesting aspect, but Martin was able to get along with everybody. And he may not have agreed with your philosophy, but he would get along with you. So back to what you're saying, okay? What else can people do today? They can stay vigilant. There was a speech that part of his letter in a Birmingham jail, talked about silence being a betrayal. And I think that those words, silence as a betrayal, is what he would want more than people to start speaking out. The demonstrations, I think he would have been very proud what happened last year in Washington, or this past year in Washington with the women's march. I think he'd be happy he would do everything he could. I don't think Donald Trump would have been elected president had Martin Luther King Jr. lived. I just don't think that would have happened.